Hello and welcome to CounterCulture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, here we are in the latest of our discussions on the coronavirus pandemic, and tonight we're going to be particularly discussing America, the American response to the pandemic, how it's being handled by President Trump, and indeed what that response tells us about American culture now, and indeed going forward into the future, what changes, if any, we can expect to see. With me to discuss this, I've got a great panel. First of all, John O'Sullivan, who's joining us from Budapest. John O'Sullivan is president of the Danube Institute. He is editor-at-large of the National Review and indeed was a special advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Andrew Klavan, who is joining us from Los Angeles, is the host of the Andrew Klavan Show on the Daily Wire. He is an award-winning author, and some of his books have been made into very successful Hollywood movies. And also Rafe Heydel-Mankoo from the New Culture Forum, who is an historian and commentator. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen, tonight. I would like to start with quite a broad question, if I could, please, Andrew. We've been discussing here a bit about, what the response to the pandemic has shown about British culture. Has it been, if you like, a typically British response or not? Would you say that the response in America has been a typically American one, whatever that might be?
Well, it depends what you're looking at. It's been typically American in the sense that we're tremendously divided. We have people on the right who feel that their civil liberties have been completely overwhelmed by the emergency powers of the state, and people on the left who feel that we should never leave our homes ever again, and we're all going to die if we pop our heads up. So those two sides are at daggers drawn. We have an amazingly different response from our president, which hasn't been properly appreciated, in my opinion, which is that this is the first true emergency of my lifetime that I can remember in which the federal government has not tried to expand its powers. I don't know whether Donald Trump can spell federalism, but he is actually operating on our very cherished federalist tradition, which is that our states should be allowed to govern themselves. And he has done that. He has refused the pressure. The press has done nothing but call him an authoritarian and a fascist and a Nazi. And yet it's the press that has been urging him to take more power. And Trump, who has been saying, no, I cherish the Constitution. I'm going to let the federal governments fend for themselves, and has let the governors largely make up their own minds, which has led to, in the left-wing Democrat states, a lot of overreach, a lot of people crushing civil liberties and keeping everything closed. And on the right, it's led to a lot of people, like in Texas, opening their governments early and trying to get people back to work. So I would say typically American in the sense we're very divided.
Is that a sort of picture you would recognize as well, John?
Well, I recognize it as being what's happening in America, sure. I mean, my own view would be a mixture of the two. I myself tend to think that we should probably obey the rules, wear masks, stay at home, mostly for the moment, although I'll slightly qualify that. But at the same time, I find it unnerving that more people in Europe don't feel a bit angry and upset about the restrictions on their civil liberties. Although I don't approve of people turning up with guns at the Michigan central government, I nonetheless think it's a good thing there are some people who feel strongly in our society about civil liberties and about normal life. And so I was slightly heartened by that. Here, it's very different, really. I would say we've had strong self-discipline among the Hungarians. And by the way, a friend of mine in Italy says the same about Italians, which might be more surprising. And the strong self-discipline has meant that really, the rules have been quite easy, not to break, but to bend slightly. So here in Budapest, a lot of people exercise walking, as we call it, but it just means walking. But they're also sitting down on park benches and moving about in family groups or in groups of two. And the police don't seem to bother that. They only intervene, as far as I can see. Unlike England, where the police no longer seem so wonderful, they only intervene here in Budapest when there's sort of groups of 6 or 7 youths making a bit of a fuss, and then they tell them separate out into smaller groups and to keep 2 meters apart. So it's really quite an easygoing application of the rules here, but the rules were imposed early, and they seem to have been fairly effective.
I mean, Rafe, would you say that America now, because of the Andrew talked about the division there, but we have seen protests and what have you. Anything like that has just simply not happened here. Would you say that America is now, the most liberty-loving country, whereas maybe once we thought that we were here in Britain?
Absolutely. Well, on the same lines, I think it's remarkable that America and Britain now find themselves in the situation where they've committed economic suicide in the short term, despite being, the two nations that forged the modern world, the two most important nations with more scientific Nobel Prizes than anywhere in the world, and that this was so badly manhandled. But what it has exposed to me is what we all knew for some time, that America is the guardian of English liberty, of those principles laid out in Magna Carta and in the Glorious Revolution, all those principles which we espoused, every true-born Englishman held to his heart, are now to be found in America, a land, of course, created by the English. The founding fathers were English, after all. As Flanders and Swan said, Englishmen getting rid of a German king. And so it is that land of liberty still, but yet what it's also shown, I think, is how dysfunctional the relationships are in America between the federal government and the states, and how broken the system is. Trump, of course, is getting a lot of flack because of his personality, but this is not a question of personality, and you can't blame the man at the top for something like this. Trump actually, in 2018, put together a pandemic plan. America has an organization solely devoted to looking at pandemics, and they had alerted to this. Everyone knew in Britain and America that there was going to be an Asian pandemic of some sort. Plans were in place. In 2019, Congress passed a Biodefense Act. So it's not at the top that the problem lies. It's in the bureaucracy of America. It's in the failure to implement these things. It's in the lack of coordination between the states and the federal government, and not knowing whose job it is to do what. There's no orchestrated plan going on there. So I think what it has exposed is, yes, land of liberty, but in a right mess. And certainly I think there's an opportunity there for either Trump or Biden to make sorting that out one of the election platforms.
Does that sort of resonate with you, Andrew? I mean,
well, again, that's very typically American. We believe in ordered liberty, but we've always been a little bit short on the order and big on the liberty. I think that, I think there's been a lot of bureaucratic screw-ups, especially at the very beginning. But I'm actually kind of impressed. I'm impressed with Trump and his team and the way they've actually acted, stripping out all the noise, stripping out, as Rafe said, all the personality. Trump's interests are very much aligned with common sense. He wants as few people to die as possible, but he wants the economy to come back as quickly as possible. And that seems to me to be the middle road that we should be treading. In Michigan, where there was this demonstration, and you have to remember the demonstrations are getting a lot of press, but they're still very limited and very small. But in Michigan, where there was this demonstration, the Michigan governor has been extremely oppressive and extremely arrogant in her uses of her emergency powers. So what you're seeing is a reaction, not an action. And that's important. I think what we have seen, places like New York have been incredibly badly managed. The mayor of New York has just not only been incompetent, but he has just exacerbated any kind of sense of community relations. The people in New York want to stay home and keep safe because the flu has hit them so badly. But I think that, we do have, because we are a huge country, and this is the thing, I lived in England for many, many years, and the hardest thing to convince Europeans of in general is just how huge this country is. England is the size of one of our states. It's the size of Oregon. I should say Britain is the size of Oregon. So when you say there's a lot of bureaucratic snafus, there are, but there's just so much more bureaucracy to be dealing with, and it's in so many different places. So I've been very impressed with the fact that Trump has kept federalism first and foremost, that he has basically said, yes, we should stay safe, but yes, we also should keep the economy going. That seems to be the right way to go. And I think that the states are each state has to be judged on its own.
John, are you impressed? Are you impressed with Trump? I mean, you know, obviously the situation in Britain, for example, and it's almost impossible to get what you would call a half decent or impartial view actually of what's happening. I mean, we've got a media here that's almost entirely anti-Trump. I mean, what would you say? Would you agree with Andrew? Are you impressed with his performance?
Well, of course, as you say, almost suicidal say that you approve of Trump if you have any number of qualifications, which I would, by the way, have to do. But nonetheless, I agree with Andrew that, first of all, yes, Trump has acted as the head of a federal government in a country in which a federal system in which the states obviously are going to do most of the heavy lifting. Secondly, I'd add, he's been very careful to bring in the private sector again and again on this, to encourage them to deal with some of the shortages, make sure that new equipment is going to be available. He's suggested, not always wisely perhaps, but as it turns out in most of these cases, correctly, that there are other ways of dealing with the virus, that there are some cures which are not simply palliatives, and we should speed up the process whereby the regulatory process whereby we make them available. I think that has proved to be correct, even if in some cases it might seem a bit risky. And to some degree, by the way, I think that's also true of Britain, where what you've had is a government actually wanted to get people like Dyson to help and encourage them to do so. But the problem is that America is no longer a society which is united on the kind of government it should have. It's a divided society. There is really quite a serious moral civil war that's going on between people who look to the American Constitution in the way Andrew's just been citing, but others who essentially really want a massive administrative state, which we have already actually extended and made more powerful. And unfortunately, while the crisis has actually done the opposite, it's encouraged the private sector to be more active, it's also encouraged the expansion and the respect for and the kind of, well, toadying is too bad a word, but the subservience to the administrative state that many people really want to see become the norm in America. And I think there is a danger that at the end of this, particularly if the Democrats win the presidency, the administrative state will have notched itself up a few more inches, more control over the society. And I would regret that.
When you say,
often the result of crisis.
When you say the administrative state and the support amongst some people for a hugely expanded one, I mean, when would you say that actually started? Is that a relatively recent phenomenon?
Well, no, I think I would bow to Andrew here. Most people think it began with Roosevelt. But on the other hand, and it was wound back a few times by the Eisenhower administration and so on, but it does have a way of it's going up 10 points and being wound down 5 and then going up another 10 points when the next crisis occurs. So I think we now have to find some way of ensuring that it just doesn't become the way in which most people feel Americans should live. And I would say, by the way, the same is true for the Brits, because although America may now be the chief standard bearer of the Magna Carta and the liberties associated with it, nonetheless, that tradition surely has not completely died in England. Under Thatcher, it got a tremendous boost. And I think we want to see it protected and revived.
I think that it often depends who you're listening to or reading, but there are some people who think that in Britain we've sort of actually forgotten these things. So we no longer are taught about them, so we've kind of forgotten about them.
I would agree with John that the private sector has been the stellar example of an industry working together across the board. I mean, you've got cases of Barber and Burberry offering to make PPE gowns and so forth, Dyson getting involved in those ventilators, Mercedes-Benz helping to get people off ventilators onto other breathing apparatus. That's been inspirational to see. The private sector, again, a champion of people's life and liberty. undoubtedly, Trump's getting a raw deal on all of this. People forget, that he was the one who wanted to stop flights from China and got a huge amount of flack for that. And that's conveniently forgotten by everyone who's now condemning him. And I think Britain and America have had a rather bad press recently over death tolls, which simply is a crude analysis to try to compare them to Europe, given the fact that the populations are far larger. People don't actually look at these things in terms of deaths per million, in which case America is far below Britain, France, Italy and Spain, and Britain is still below European countries on a per capita basis. And of course, Britain and America have much more ethnic diversity than European countries, and we know that the highest risk groups are people from ethnic minorities, and yet nowhere do you see that in any of the analytics. Similarly, not to their credit, they're also the fattest nations in that comparison chart. And so, if someone would actually try to analyse that out, yes. I think a lot of the attacks made on Trump and Johnson, who did start too late, has to be said, but they are exaggerated and unfounded on that level. But certainly, if I were Biden, I would, as John said, I would look to FDR if I wanted to offer up an alternative to Trump and appeal to those keen on a bigger state and offer a new deal. We may not like it these days, but that basically was the hope that was given after the Great Depression in creating a safety net socially and economically. And I think that is going to actually be one of the dividing lines that we'll see at this election, and a lot hangs in the balance based upon that.
Can I ask you already, this is a very, I think, interesting thing we had with Brexit here. We had something called Brexit derangement syndrome, right? So, and you know what I'm going to ask. There is this seems to be an entirely irrational hatred of Trump, a Trump derangement syndrome. Andrew, what do you think that shows? Regardless of the pandemic, if you like, ongoing. It is not just about hating someone's politics, is it?
Oh, no, it's not. And remember that there was Bush derangement syndrome before this. Trump has amped it up because of his personality and his brusqueness. But John is absolutely right. The division in this country is no longer up until the 1970s and into the 1980s. The division in this country used to be between people saying, yes, we love our Constitution and our tradition, but we would like a little bit more of a welfare state, a safety net to maintain people in times of trouble. That was a rational debate. We are no longer in that debate. We are now in the debate whether the Constitution should be operational at all. This week, Harvard law professor and a law professor from, I think, the University of Arizona published an article in The Atlantic saying that the Chinese have been right, that censorship and surveillance is absolutely necessary. And so we're really dealing with people who have lost the plot of America altogether. And as I see it, what they had was this beautiful vision of globalism in which the elites were going to run the world in their expertise. They were going to make a lot of money in their expertise, and they were going to pay the rest of us a universal income to sort of make us go away, that our lives didn't have to have dignity or purpose or meaning. We just needed some cash in our pockets, and we'd be quiet while robots did all the work, and they just sat around and thought great thoughts and basically invented the technology of the future. Trump has very much, with his nationalism and his simple instinct for the country, his instinct of love of country and his instinct of love of the traditions of the country, he has just thrown a wrench in that operation. And you hear people talking about our dislike of elites and experts as if there was something wrong with that, and as if elites and experts had done such a great job. America has been in a war for 20 years in Afghanistan, and that was the elites and experts got us into that. We had for 3 years, our life expectancy was dropping because people were killing themselves at such a high rate that it was overtaking whatever medical advances there were. And that was simply despair, because all of our jobs had been farmed out to China and other places, and people were just dying in the middle of the country from meth addiction and other forms of despair. Something was terribly, terribly wrong that caused the people to rise up and send Trump to the White House, which they only just barely did. And not once have any of the elites, any of the experts, including some of the elites on the right, not once has anyone said, what are they trying to tell us here? What have we done wrong? Is there some other voice that should be included? Donald Trump is a symptom. He is not the cause of this division. He is the people who feel that they have not been heard, that their lives have been taken away, that their voices have been taken away, that they are fired from their jobs for saying that men can be different from women. They're fired from their jobs for remarks they may have made personally on Facebook. They have lost their rights to be themselves and to live their individual lives. And Trump was basically a cri de coeur, just a cry to be listened to give somebody a voice that would speak for those people. And Trump has done that, and that's what they hate him for. They hate him because he is a bowling ball that has rolled down into their perfect global vision and just knocked it askew.
Let me say, well, it seems to me that we are all sitting around this table members of the elites or an elite, but we are traitors to our class, and we recognize, since we're in that class, that experts differ. That if you got a good doctor saying you were going to die on Thursday, you'd ask for a second opinion. And I think that that's true across the system. And if you have a problem like Brexit, membership of the EU, that's composed of so many different expertises, so to speak, that you can't possibly be an expert on it. Now, what's the problem we have? I would put it this way, responding to Andrew. The elites managed to solve a problem which had long puzzled many of them, and that is, how do you get rid of democracy without getting rid of democracy? And the answer is you transfer more and more political decisions, which you declare to be terribly important, from democratic institutions accountable to the voters to non-democratic institutions accountable to themselves, or to a general amorphous atmosphere of progressivism. And that's the problem. They carried that out, and the rest of us kind of couldn't quite work out what was going on. How come more and more times we complained about something, the politicians, the ministers, and the civil servants would say, I'm afraid there is nothing we can do that. In Britain, they'd say, well, that was a European decision. We had to accept it. In America, they'd say, well, that was the decision of the Supreme Court. That's all we can do. We must go along with it. We can't possibly, in a sense, change the law. Now, we didn't understand how this had happened, but we knew something was wrong. Trump came along and he articulated these feelings, but he didn't articulate them very well, because that's not the kind of thing he does. What he does is express powerfully emotions which people feel but don't quite make the case. It's up to, therefore, intellectuals, and they've come forward in quite large numbers to begin to articulate in Britain and America, in Brexit and other places in Central Europe, to articulate the grievances of people who knew they were being cheated but couldn't work out how the three-card trick had been played on them.
Absolutely, and certainly, just as Trump, I'm reminded of G.K. Chesterton, for we are the people of England who have not spoken yet, and certainly Trump gave voice to the American people, the downtrodden, just as John and Andrew are saying, and of course we've seen that here too with Brexit, and certainly the attempt to erase the connection, the power levers between the public and the legislatures and the elected officials got to a point where it seemed as if the Glorious Revolution, which was all about parliaments taking power from the crown in expanding democracy, we had our own revolution in terms of trying a battle between parliamentary sovereignty and sovereignty of the people. And it came very close over the last year in terms of who would win that. And thankfully, because of Boris Johnson's intervention at the end, we did win that. But the question remains, did we win the war or just a battle? And how long is this going to last? And of course, 2020 will give us one indication in America, but it remains to be seen whether the elites, have been defeated in a certain sense, or whether they're just wounded and seeing how they can come back. But then in another sense, it's the same case in Europe. And of course, what coronavirus has shown Europe is how self-interested the member states of the European Union are when push comes to shove.
Is it? Trump obviously is onto a bit of a winner as well, isn't he? When he said quite recently, in fact, I think it was yesterday, about the idea of tariffs on China. That somehow there was talk that somehow China is going to have to pay somehow. There was talk, I think, of non-repayment of debt repayments, but he said no to that. But that there should maybe be tariffs. This is surely going to be a winner in the coming election, is it not?
Oh, I think it definitely is, and Biden's friendships with China and his, this is something that Trump has been talking about a long time. And if you want to find the source of Trump derangement, it may well start right here with his attacks, his continual attacks on China, in the same way that Reagan upended the foreign policy consensus by saying, no, we don't have to maintain relations with the Soviet Union. We should beat them. We should defeat them in the Cold War. He said he was alone in saying that, except for Margaret Thatcher and the Pope. And nobody thought that that was possible. And it upended the wisdom of all the poobahs in the State Department. Well, the same thing is true right now. China has interacted and interwoven itself with our universities, our media, and our press so completely that the idea that you can basically say, no, wait a minute, morally, this is not a good country, that China is not a good country. We should not deal with them as moral equals. They are not our moral equals. They oppress their people terribly. Some of the stories that have been confirmed coming out of China sound like bad thriller novels. The harvesting of organs from people who dissent and from disenfranchised groups in their prisons. I mean, this is the kind, we've seen on TV the oppression of the people in Hong Kong. And yet, nobody in the left-wing press, by which I mean almost all the press in America, is willing to come out and just say, I may not like Donald Trump, but he has a point here. Yesterday, the New York Times was attacking Trump for trying to find out how much of this virus originated with the laboratories in Wuhan. We've just seen again and again, they tell us if we call this the Chinese flu, as they say the Spanish flu, that we're racist. So this is going to be a powerful, powerful narrative, because the people hear this, they know what China is. They're not going to be fooled, I don't think, by the press. And Joe Biden, listen, Joe Biden, they are trying their best. Joe Biden at this point is a hologram. I'm not even sure he's actually there. I think he is a projection of the press and the left wing and the Democrat Party that is just a three-dimensional placeholder. He himself said he's going to be a placeholder president. He can barely put an English sentence together. He is not being called on to defend himself against rape allegations, which, had they been leveled against a Republican, would be all the news. And his relations with China and his friendliness toward China and his son Hunter's profits from China are all going to come into question. And I just don't think the press is going to be able to keep it silent.
Absolutely. And see, and the thing is that, Trump has actually been the only leader in the Western world to actually understand what's been happening over the last few years. And it's been so depressing, embarrassing, and actually sickening to see the docile nature of our European leaders when it comes to handling China, very happy to take its money and let it get itself embedded firmly into the infrastructure and the very backbone of Europe, and even to see the Conservative government, willing to go along with Huawei until recently. But you shake your head in disbelief, because the reality is we are in a new Cold War. China is the new Soviet Union, and anyone who thinks we're not in a Cold War now is going to be severely up for a rude awakening over the next few years. And Trump has been the only person to fully understand and recognize that. And so he's got every right to make that a key part of his re-election platform, to contrast himself with Biden, who's quite frankly a rum lot in comparison.
What does the fact that the Democrats have got Biden up? What does that say about the Democratic Party? I mean, is it actually going the same way as Labour in Britain, would you say? Is that what, John?
Well, no, I think they're doing rather well, unfortunately. Apart from the fact that Biden is obviously a bad candidate, and in almost any other circumstances wouldn't be making it to the candidacy, and may yet not do so. But the fact is controlling one of the houses of Congress. It did well in the last elections. It may do well. It may win the Senate this one. I think it won't, but it may. And of course, it's bad though he is, Biden is slightly leading Trump in the polls. I don't think that will turn out to happen on the day, but that's another matter. So yes, you've got to take them seriously. Why is that? It's because they essentially have created an electorate partly by immigration, partly by other methods, in which they are representatives of what they think of as a new America, a different America, an America which will in future be less self-reliant, less independent-minded, less liberal in the true sense of the word, and more worshipful of big government, which gives them free stuff. And unfortunately, that's the way. There's always a strong appetite for that kind of policy. So I don't dismiss them. I think they're really serious, a serious threat to the kind of America that, for example, Andrew is, so to speak, representing here around the table.
Speaking of a kind of America, this really brings us on to what we would call the culture wars, if you like. And you've already alluded to it in different ways, actually. But when Andrew was talking about what, Trump was saying, what people really thought, and they didn't have an outlet. Do you think that, that this pandemic will sort of wipe that away once and for all? And when I talk about culture wars, I'm talking about the identity politics, the kind of the woke culture. Do you think that, because it's obviously gone off of the front page for a while, but I wonder whether it's so entrenched that it will just simply return, whether we're actually seeing it creeping back anyway. Do you think that what's happening now will really make a difference, Andrew?
One of the things I think that John is hitting upon that really has to be focused on is the difference between intellectual power and what we'll call mechanical power. The left is out of ideas. The reason they have this candidate who's essentially a walking houseplant, and he's being opposed, his chief opposition is a 102-year-old communist spouting Marxist ideas who really doesn't realize the Soviet Union has fallen, is because they are literally out of ideas. They do not have an idea it's not from the 19th century, and all those ideas since the 19th century have failed in practice. So they have nothing intellectually to offer. A long time ago in the 50s or 60s, a very famous critic named Lionel Trilling said there is no intellectual life on the right. Well, that is now true of the left. All the intellection is being done on the right. All the thinking, arguing, debating is being done on the right. However, they have implanted a tremendous mechanism for enforcing their points of view, which is, of course, giving away free stuff is one of them. That always is good. But as John said, the administrative state and bad Supreme Court decisions that have given a tremendous power to the administrative state is part of it. And now you have the left arguing that that's even better than the Constitution. And also you have civil rights law. There's a wonderful new book, an important new book by Christopher Caldwell called The Age of Entitlement, which traces how civil rights law has now set up an alternative constitution, and it's enforced by lawsuits. So if you say, if I, for instance, go on the air and make a comment like men and women are different, and some left-wing website comes after me for that, it's possible that my sponsors will abandon me because they're afraid of being sued, not because they're afraid of losing money from their customers, because their customers all know men and women are different. They're afraid that they will be sued as a civil rights violation, and that their support of me will be proof in that lawsuit, and that has worked in the past. So the left, being empty of ideas, has set up a tremendous mechanism of power, which also includes their takeover of our academies, our entertainment industry, and our news industry, that really is separate from their ideas. And so what we're going to see, and what we did see with Trump, is the fact that some of our ancient mechanisms, like the Electoral College, saved us from the absolute steamrolling effect of this mechanism they've put in place. And there's a very powerful open question of whether Trump is canny enough and smart enough to start to dissemble the mechanism that they have built, because that's the key thing. That is what Reagan failed to do. And I don't know whether Trump is going to do it. We really have to start to reverse the kind of laws. Maybe he did it with his Supreme Court appointments. We'll see. But that's the difference. You have to understand they're not winning on ideas. They're winning on pure power.
That's absolutely right.
Can I just give...
Basically, what's happening...
That's just like...
Sorry,
John,
after you, John.
After you, John. Go on.
Thank you very much. Well, I just was going to say, in the last week, there's been an example of what Andrew has just described, namely the left running out of ideas, but at the same time having the power to make sure that it, so to speak, wins. And that was last week. Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs from the extreme left brought out a movie called Planet of the Humans, which argues that that for the left to rely on the renewables industry to provide energy without damaging the atmosphere is a myth, a delusion, and furthermore, delusion which has been used by ruthless capitalists to make millions out of the delusion. Now, this strikes at the very heart of the argument that the left, the moderate left, has been making. So it's an interesting fact that this happened. First of all, the movie is quite a good movie from the standpoint of telling a good story and making a sort of honest argument. It comes up with a ridiculous solution, namely, essentially, we have to have fewer human beings. Well, I don't see you can achieve that in any decent way myself, other than relying on people to have fewer babies voluntarily. And I don't think that's enough for socialists generally. But the point is that this film is a news item. I mean, it's Michael Moore, a strong left-winger, rejecting the orthodoxy of the left, making a film that makes a good argument. And you would think everybody would be talking about it. Well, a lot of people are, because 3 million people watched it free on the internet. But you can't find any references to it in a lot of news stories in Google and elsewhere, except people are demanding that the film be banned. So on the one hand, even the slightest deviation from the left's position becomes impossible to get a hearing for in a normal way. And that, of course, is a society in which honest argument and debate cannot persist if even on the left people get shouted down for saying things that the whole left believed 10 minutes before.
And that's, of course, because the godless left have reverted to type and have made their ideology into religious faith, and they are zealots, and anyone who varies one iota from scripture is going to be cast out as a blasphemer and a heathen. And so you're seeing done to Michael Moore what we've seen happen to Germaine Greer and all these other figures of the old left who are now being cannibalized by their own. And for me, one of the great tragedies of, or potential tragedies of coronavirus, is that we may have lost, or we may lose the opportunity that we had up until a couple of months ago, both in Britain and America, to actually reverse that long march through the institutions. Because, there have been two power sources in both countries. In governance in this country, we've always had, conservatives are the natural party of governance, but in all the institutions of education and the civil service and in the media, you've got the soft power of the left, which is arguably more influential. And they've basically never engaged with each other properly. And so with Dominic Cummings, I think more than Boris Johnson actually behind the scenes, we really had a great chance to try to reverse that. And I just wonder, in this country, having expended so much of our personal finances, whether we'll be able to live up to our promises to the former Labour Party voting members of the Red Wall and elsewhere to prove the credentials of living up to their expectations and providing them with the infrastructure and everything that they needed. And that may actually derail what we thought were 10 years, or we could actually try to reverse that trend. And we may find something similar in America, because America has full employment, had a deregulation, boosted confidence in business. You had such a good situation there. The foreign policy of Trump turned Obama on its head and was so encouraging. And nobody since Coolidge had actually delivered on their campaign promises more. People forget that, and that's something that people look at when it comes to election times. And I think it would be a great shame if those two unique opportunities were, had to be abandoned because of all of this. Yes,
I'm frustrated. I mean, do you think the outlook is bleak? I mean, that sounds like a bleak outlook to me, actually. Though, that there was a chance, but that's now sort of not been squandered, but frustrated by what's been happening.
No, I mean, I think, listen, conservatives are usually conservatives because they have a talent for seeing disaster that proceeds from change. They have a talent for building the constellation from any change to complete disaster. But no, I think we actually are in a very an interesting balance. We're kind of on the razor's edge. I have never heard, because of all the things we're talking about, the left has become completely isolated from the voice of the people altogether. I have never seen this kind of pre-French Revolution arrogance coming from the elites in America before, but I'm seeing it now. I watch the late night comedians, and these guys who make literally $15 million a year to go on TV and make jokes are sneering at people who want to go back to work because they're starving to death and their small businesses are collapsing, and they're making fun of them and they're making jokes about them. And this has got to resonate. I mean, I think that the elites have become so separated because they have isolated power in mechanisms rather than ideas. Mm-hmm. The elites have managed to become so separated from the ordinary human being who walks the street and lives and dies and pays his taxes, that they now sound very much as if they should be wearing those long curly French wigs from the 18th century. And I think that is going to have an effect, I hope, at the polls. You know, it's funny. John was saying this before. I am an elite in that sense. I mean, my happy place is to drink Chardonnay and discuss literature. That's what I want to be doing. But it's not a leap of Christ-like vision for me to imagine that the guy who is currently delivering the groceries that are keeping this old man alive also has a life and also has an inner vision and also has opinions that deserve just as much recognition as mine. And yet in America, that which used to be the standard, it used to define our movie business, it used to define our press, it used to define our intellectual life, is now gone and has been replaced by some kind of European continental aristocracy of mind that simply does not believe in the people anymore.
As a matter of fact, I used to argue that America is the only genuine social democracy in the world, mm-hmm. because it's a democracy in which everybody feels they have a right to an opinion and that they don't have to defer to everyone else's opinion. Now, that's less true than it used to be. It's less true today than, say, in 1960, but it's still true. And I think to answer the question about how we get out of this current situation, I suppose, electorally in the next few years in the UK, I think we have to say this, that if we leave if we actually do in every full sense leave the European Union at the end of the year, and we are emerging at the same time from the pandemic shutdown, and we have to revive the economy and get things going again, I think Boris could actually do this. I think he could do it by appealing to the British people on the lines of, we've just had two great crises dumped in our laps. We have to handle them alone, and we have to handle them in ways that revive, that on the basis of greater liberty, greater initiative, greater opportunity for everyone in the country. And that's what we're going to do. And so instead of leaning back into the arms of the administrative state, he actually goes out and simply says, do you have it in you? Under Thatcher, we discovered that the old virtues, the vigorous virtues, as she called them, had been latent. They hadn't died in us. And they revived quite quickly. It only took about 5 years before we were again the fourth largest economy in the world. Maybe the same virtues, plus the virtues of love of country and desire to excel as a nation as well as people. I think those vigorous, those kind of virtues, you might call them the patriotic as opposed to the economic virtues, I think they're still in us. And I think that they can be brought out by bold leadership. You've got that ability.
John, you've put a spring in my step for the weekend. Thank you. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time tonight. Andrew Klavan, John O'Sullivan, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. It's been a great conversation. I do hope that maybe we can get together again later in the year, maybe around the time of that election, and have a talk about it. So thank you very much once again. That's it for Counterculture this week. So I hope to see you next time, and please do subscribe, won't you? Thanks very much.